He was just a pup when he first wandered into the wild, lost, trembling, and chased by death. But as the moonlight lit the clearing where wolves once hunted, Shadow stood tall, his breath steady, his eyes filled not with fear, but purpose. Ranger, the silent warrior of the woods, watched from the edge. The past had tested him, the present had shaped him, but the future, that would be decided by what Shadow did next. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. The wind tore through the Bitterroot National Forest like a furious spirit, lashing at the snow-covered pines and howling across the ridgelines like it was chasing something unseen. Flurries of icy snow danced sideways, clinging to branches and burying fallen logs. It was late January, near dusk, and the sky above Montana had turned a deep iron gray, thick with clouds swollen with more snow to come. The world had gone cold and white and wild, and in the midst of it, a single figure moved with frantic steps. Shadow was a 10-month-old German shepherd with dark, sable fur that looked nearly black when wet. His ears were large and pointed, always flicking to every sound, and his eyes, deep amber, shimmered with a mixture of intelligence and worry. He wasn't fully grown yet, lankier than a mature dog, his body still developing strength to match the training he had begun just 3 months ago. Today was supposed to be a routine exercise with his handler in the wild terrain. Nothing more than a tracking drill and some recall practice, but nothing was routine anymore. A crack like thunder had split the mountain silence earlier in the afternoon. Then the earth moved. Ben Carson had shouted something, but the noise had drowned him out. Shadow remembered a flash of red, Ben's winter jacket, then a roar as the ground gave way under a heavy overhang. The snow came down like a wall, taking broken tree limbs and loose boulders with it. And now, Shadow was alone. Ben Carson was a 43-year-old former Army sergeant with a wiry build, cropped graying hair, and a face carved by wind, war, and memory after retiring. He joined the Forest Service's K9 training initiative to help struggling dogs find purpose, just like he'd done for himself. Shadow was his first assignment since leaving the military, despite his tough exterior and no-nonsense attitude. Ben had a deep loyalty to those he trained, human or animal. A roadside explosion during his second tour in Afghanistan had left him with chronic pain in his right leg and a haunting quiet in his eyes. That same blast had taught him the cost of leaving someone behind. Shadow whined as the wind picked up again. His paws sank slightly in the snowpack, and he turned in circles, barking once, twice sharp. High-pitched barks that were snatched by the wind and lost in the trees. No answer, no familiar whistle, no scent of Ben in the gusts. He circled back to where the collapse had happened. Nothing but broken pines and a slope of churned snow. His sharp nose twitched, but the scent trail was gone, washed out by the wind and powdered snow. He growled low, confused and scared. His tail curled low between his legs but not tucked. He hadn't given up yet. Then came a sound that made every muscle in his young body tighten. It started as a rustle, 2 even for wind, then crunching snow, soft, calculated steps. Shadow froze. From the thickets beyond the fallen logs, shapes emerged, 5, maybe 6. Wolves, lean. Hungry winter wolves, their fur matted and gray, eyes glowing yellow in the dimming light. One of them growled low, a breathy snarl that spread from one to the others. Their formation tightened. Shadow backed up slowly, baring his teeth in reflex. He had never fought. He had never needed to. Ben had been there for every danger until now. The leader of the wolves stepped forward. Its shoulders were scarred. One eye clouded white, the other sharp and feral. It sniffed the air, then snarled, sensing youth and fear. Shadow braced himself to run, but before he could even twitch, something heavy thundered through the woods behind him. It was a sound unlike anything he had heard, deep, furious, controlled. Then a blur of fur crashed through the brush. The wolves turned too late. A massive German shepherd slammed into the lead wolf with bone-jarring force, sending it tumbling backward into a snowbank. Another wolf lunged, only to be caught mid-air and slammed against a tree. Shadow watched in awe. The new dog, older, broader, fur a mix of gray and tan with streaks of black, moved with frightening precision. His body was built like a tank, and his jaws clamped like a machine. His presence sent the remaining wolves scrambling back, growling but wary. They didn't run, not yet, but they didn't press forward again either. The old shepherd stood still now, muscles bristling under a thick winter coat, eyes locked on the wolves. A long scar ran down his left flank, visible even beneath the fur. He didn't growl, he didn't bark, he simply existed, and that was enough. The wolves finally broke and retreated, melting back into the thickets. The older dog turned toward Shadow just once. Their eyes met, briefly. Then the stranger turned and walked away without a word, disappearing into the underbrush like smoke. Shadow stood frozen. He had just witnessed something he couldn't explain, a power he couldn't name. He knew nothing about this stranger. But something inside him stirred, a strength, a safety, wisdom. That was what the stranger had. And now, Shadow was alone again, but not without direction. He sniffed the air, catching the fading scent of the older shepherd, without hesitation. Shadow started walking, following, far away, under a twisted pine partially covered by snow. Ben Carson stirred. Blood crusted over a gash on his forehead. His leg throbbed with sharp pain, pinned awkwardly beneath a branch. He groaned, tried to move, and failed. His fingers curled into the snow as the cold seeped deeper into his clothes. But he didn't call for help. Instead, he whispered the name of his dog. Shadow, you better still be alive. Boy, the trail was barely visible, but Shadow followed it like it was carved into the snow. The scent was faint, fading with each gust of cold Montana wind, but it was there, ranger's scent, part pine, part old smoke, and something deeper, the kind of scent that clung to those who had seen too much and spoken too little. The older shepherd had vanished into the underbrush after saving Shadow's life. But something in his posture, in that single glance over his shoulder, had not been final. Shadow sensed it, or maybe he just needed to believe it. He moved quietly now, low to the ground, his breathing controlled. The storm had begun to settle into a dense, oppressive mist that clung to the pines like spider webs. It was past dawn, though no light made it through the forest canopy. Shadow had not slept. Hunger gnawed at him, and his body ached from the cold. But he didn't stop. Every so often, he'd bark once, soft, low, but only silence answered. Then, through a break in the trees, he saw a movement. Ranger stood beside a shallow stream, drinking silently. His hulking frame was still, head lowered, the rise and fall of his chest slow and deliberate. He hadn't been startled by Shadow's approach. He had known the pup was coming long before he arrived. When Shadow crept closer, Ranger didn't look up. "If you're going to follow me," the older shepherd said without turning, "you better stop making so much noise." Shadow paused. Unsure, his ears flattened. "Please," he said with a whimper. "I don't know what else to do." Now, Ranger looked at him, eyes dark and unreadable. "I don't need a shadow," he growled. "Especially not one that slows me down." "I can learn," Shadow insisted. "I will." Ranger's gaze lingered on him for a long moment before he turned back toward the woods. "If you want to survive, don't make me regret not leaving you for the wolves." It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no. For hours. Shadow followed. Ranger didn't speak again. He moved like water through the trees, his steps silent, his nose always scanning the air, his ears flicking at sounds Shadow couldn't hear. The pup tried to mimic him, but every broken twig beneath his paws felt like thunder. Ranger would occasionally glance back with irritation but offered no correction. This. Shadow would learn the hard way. As the light faded and the snow returned, this time as a gentle dusting rather than a storm. Ranger came to a stop near a rock outcrop and finally spoke. "Something's been circling." Shadow stiffened. The wolves too quiet for elk, too curious for bears. He sniffed once, one, maybe two, could be scouts. Shadow's pulse quickened. "Don't panic," Ranger warned. "They're watching for weakness. Don't show them any." "But," Shadow began, quiet. Ranger's voice was ice. "You want to learn something, then earn it." The older shepherd moved forward into a shallow clearing bordered by brush. Then, without warning, he turned and lunged at Shadow. The younger dog yelped and ducked, clumsy, falling on his side in the snow. Ranger didn't strike again. He just stared, too slow. He said, "You hear me tell you to be quiet, and your first thought is to speak. You feel danger, and you freeze. That'll get you killed." Shadow scrambled up, ears back. "I didn't expect." "Exactly. You didn't. Now again, this time." Shadow tried to stay on his paws, but his balance faltered as Ranger feinted and swept his leg. Down he went again, snow in his mouth, his legs tangled beneath him. "You have speed," Ranger said, circling, but no focus, no control, and worse, you hesitate. That's fear. You let fear lead you. It'll bury you. Shadow's chest heaved, both from exertion and shame. His instincts screamed at him to run, but he stayed when Ranger came again. Shadow jumped sideways, awkward but deliberate, and this time didn't fall. Ranger didn't praise, he simply stopped. Better. At the same time, far south of the forest edge, Ben Carson dragged himself over a frozen trail. His right leg twisted awkwardly. A deep gash ran down his temple, caked with frozen blood. He had managed to free himself from the fallen branch, though it had taken hours and left him drained. Every movement sent white-hot sparks up his back. But he kept going, one hand after another in the snow. When he finally collapsed near a dirt path, half buried in snow, he saw boots approaching through the flurry. "Sir, you okay?" The voice belonged to a woman, early 30s, dressed in a Green Park Ranger coat with the collar turned up. Her blonde hair was pulled tight under a wool cap, and she moved with the firm, assured gait of someone used to taking charge. This was Emily Lang, a U.S. and Forest Service officer and Field Patrol veteran with a quiet presence and eyes that missed nothing. Emily had joined the service after a childhood incident that had never left her. A German shepherd had once pulled her from a creek during a spring flood when she was 6. Since then, she'd never questioned what dogs could do. Now, as she helped Ben to his feet and supported him toward her snowmobile, she asked what had happened. "My dog," Ben gasped. "Shadow. He's out there. He saved me before the fall. He's just a pup." Emily didn't hesitate. "Then we find him. Back at her ranger outpost, a small wooden cabin with maps pinned to every wall and radios humming low." Emily pulled out an updated chart of the southern ridgeline. "This area was hit hardest by the snowstorm," she said. tracing the path with a gloved finger. If Shadow's smart, and he's your dog, so I'll assume he is, he'd head toward the ridge for higher ground and visibility. Ben, wrapped in a wool blanket and sipping lukewarm coffee, nodded. He follows training. He tracks better than I did at that age. Emily smiled faintly. Then he's moving. Let's hope he's not alone. Back in the forest. Night was settling again. Ranger had set a slow pace now, allowing Shadow to walk beside him. The younger dog limped slightly but didn't complain. Each time he stumbled, he corrected faster. Each time he heard a sound, he didn't flinch. He listened. Ranger stopped once more. Sense stronger. Wolves are back. Shadow didn't speak. His body tensed, but he stayed quiet. The older dog tilted his head, approving. You're starting to learn. The air had grown sharper, crisper with each passing hour, and now it bit into Shadow's coat despite its thickness. Beneath the pine canopy of Bitterroot's lower ridge, the snow was thinner, giving way to patches of frozen moss and hardened earth. The sound of trickling water whispered somewhere up ahead. It smelled of mineral-rich runoff and stone, a scent that drew both animals and danger alike. Ranger walked with his usual quiet strength, paws barely making a sound as he led Shadow toward the stream. They hadn't spoken in hours. Not that Ranger was ever one to talk. Shadow had grown quieter too, more focused, his body lower to the ground, his ears tuned to every flicker of movement. The clumsiness of the day before was still there, but dulled now, replaced with calculation. His paws no longer crashed through snowbanks but slid with intention, testing for stability before committing to a step. He was learning, still. He was starving. Hunger clawed at his ribs like an echo of the wolves that haunted his dreams. He had barely eaten since the storm, and now, as the gurgle of the river grew louder, so did the gnawing emptiness in his belly when they reached the bank. Ranger didn't speak. He simply stepped forward into the shallow water. His thick winter coat bristled as the icy stream rose to his knees, but he moved like it was nothing more than grass. Then he stilled. Shadow crouched nearby, watching. Ranger's eyes locked on the water. His ears didn't move. His body didn't twitch. The current rushed past him, swirling with flashes of silver just beneath the surface. Then, so fast it was almost invisible. Ranger's paw sliced through the stream. A fat rainbow trout flopped onto the snow-covered stones with a dull thump, scales glinting like a broken prism. Shadow's mouth watered. Ranger didn't look at him. Your turn. The pup hesitated, paws scraping against icy stones as he moved toward the river. The water was colder than anything he had felt before. It wrapped around his legs like fangs, sapping his strength. He grit his teeth and stepped deeper. His first strike missed completely, his paw swinging wildly through empty water and soaking his muzzle. The fish scattered. He growled in frustration. "Be still," Ranger said without looking. Shadow tried again. Another miss, then another. Water flew everywhere. His legs shook. "You move like a deer that forgot how to walk." Ranger muttered, "I'm trying." "Don't try. Do." Shadow forced himself to stop. Drawing breath through his nose, he studied the water. He watched the current, the fish patterns, the way they darted only when disturbed. He began to notice how they hovered in slow pools, how they hesitated before each burst of motion. Then, finally, he moved. His paw struck true, not perfect, but enough. A small trout launched onto the bank, flopping in desperate arcs. He stood frozen for a second. Stunned, Ranger only gave a single nod before turning away, and tearing into his own catch. Shadow leapt after his prize, biting into the fish. It was cold, fresh, and wild. The best thing he had ever tasted. Far below the ridge, beneath the shadow of burned-out pines and snow-dusted cliffs, Emily Lang crouched near a narrow bend in a half-frozen stream. Her gloved fingers brushed across a track. Paw prints, wide and firm, not left by a wild wolf, but by something heavier, more deliberate, a dog's print. Shadows. She stood up slowly, scanning the tree line. Emily was no stranger to field tracking. At 33. She had worked as a ranger for nearly a decade. She was lean and long-legged, with a quiet authority in the way she carried herself. Though soft-spoken, she never hesitated to take control in emergencies, a skill born from years of witnessing both animal tragedies and human recklessness. Her past wasn't often discussed, but those who knew her remembered the story of a German shepherd who once pulled her from a flash flood at age 6. That dog, unnamed and never seen again, had been the reason she'd entered this life. Anything, came Ben's voice, strained from behind. Ben Carson walked stiffly along the trail, leaning slightly on a hiking pole Emily had given him. His leg throbbed from the injury, but he ignored it, eyes scanning every tree. Emily pointed at the tracks. Shadow's been through here. Recently. Ben's face lit up for the first time in hours. Is he alone? She hesitated. No. There's another set of prints. Larger, same shape. Could be a wild shepherd or a stray. Doesn't match any wolf I've seen. Could be good. Could be trouble. Ben nodded. If he's with someone, maybe they're helping him. We have to hurry. Emily pulled out a Forest Service radio. I'll call in a check for possible wolf movement along the southern basin. If they're trailing these two, we need to know now. Oh, upstream. As the snow began to fall again in slow, drifting flakes, Shadow lay curled beside Ranger beneath a dense cedar, stomach finally full. Ranger rested with his head on his paws, eyes half-lidded but alert. Shadow dared to speak. Why did you save me? Ranger didn't open his eyes, didn't save you. Killed wolves. You were just nearby. But you stayed. The silence hung for a while, long enough that Shadow thought he'd been ignored. Then Ranger said, You reminded me of someone. Shadow tilted his head. Another dog. Ranger's eyes opened, dark and unreadable. No. A soldier. Shadow didn't understand, but he didn't press. He let the quiet speak instead. The moon rose like a cold sentinel over the Bitterroot Range, casting silvery light across the snow-draped forest floor. Frost clung to the pines like armor, and the wind had died down to a breathless hush, as though the forest itself was holding back, waiting. In the clearing beneath a narrow ridge, Shadow stood in the shadows of a moss-covered boulder, heart hammering so loud he feared it would betray his position. Across from him, beyond the broken stumps and frost-bitten brush, glowing yellow eyes blinked in unison, one by one. The wolves emerged, shadows among shadows. Their fur was thick and dusted with rime, their eyes hungry and calculating. There were 7 of them tonight, but Shadow's gaze locked onto only one. Grave. He was larger than the others, older too. His coat was a patchwork of dark gray and black, riddled with old scars. One fang protruded slightly even when his mouth was closed, and his left foreleg had a slight hitch, a reminder of a fight long past. His eyes, however, were sharp as broken glass. Grave had been the leader of this pack for years, and he didn't take kindly to trespassers, especially dogs. Ranger stood beside Shadow, calm and unmoving, like stone forged from winter. His body was relaxed, but every muscle was coiled beneath the surface. "They're not here for me," Ranger said quietly. "They've smelled you. They know you're still green." Shadow's ears flattened, a tremor rippling down his back. "This is your test," Ranger continued. "I won't step in." Shadow turned sharply, but Ranger's gaze didn't waver. "Either you make them fear you, or you die. It wasn't a threat, it was fact." Grave stepped forward, claws cracking the frost with each step. His lip curled. "Well," he growled, voice deep and guttural, "the pup returns. I expected to find your bones picked clean by now." Shadow said nothing. He remembered what Ranger had taught him. Silence could be power. Grave tilted his head mockingly. "Do you speak, or just tremble like fallen leaves?" "Still." Shadow didn't answer. The silence stretched, and the wolves began to circle. Not close, yet, but enough to box him in. "I remember your scent," Grave went on. "You ran like prey. You still smell like it." Ranger didn't move. His eyes were on Shadow. Grave stopped and stared directly at the young shepherd. "Let's see if the cub has grown teeth." He lunged. Shadow jumped sideways, barely avoiding the jaws that snapped where his neck had just been. He landed awkwardly, but stayed upright. His instincts screamed to run, but he didn't. He faced Grave head-on. The wolf circled back. The pack growled low, their tails twitching, but none interfered. This was between their leader and the pup. Grave attacked again, faster this time. His jaws aimed low. Shadow dodged left, then twisted sharply. He remembered the river, the fish, the rhythm. Don't chase, anticipate. When Grave leapt a third time, Shadow didn't flinch. He ducked just before impact, pivoted with all the force in his back legs, and lashed out. His claws raked across Grave's snout. Blood sprayed into the snow. Grave howled, jerking back, one of his ears torn down the middle. The clearing fell deathly silent. The wolves hesitated. Shadow stood panting, legs trembling, blood smeared on his paw. His chest rose and fell, but his eyes stayed locked on Grave. The old wolf didn't attack again. He stood, blood dripping from his face, growl low and uncertain. He looked at the other wolves. No one moved. Then, slowly, with grudging stiffness, Grave turned and melted into the trees. One by one, the wolves followed. Shadow didn't move until the last set of eyes disappeared into the brush. Then Ranger stepped forward. For a long moment, he said nothing. Finally, he nodded once. "You're ready," far across the slope, less than a mile from the clearing. Ben Carson knelt near a fallen log, his breath fogging in the cold. Emily Lang stood beside him, one hand resting lightly on her radio, the other gripping a small flashlight that barely cut through the trees. They had heard the wolves minutes ago, one long, drawn-out howl, followed by several shorter ones. Then nothing. No fighting, no chase, just silence. Emily, normally composed and analytical, narrowed her eyes toward the dark ridge. "That's not how wolves behave when they corner something," she said. Ben rose slowly, favoring his injured leg. "You think they backed off?" She didn't answer right away. "Then, or were made to." Ben's lips tightened. "Shadow." Emily adjusted the straps on her backpack. "We're close. I'd bet my badge on it." They kept moving, faster now. The snow was deeper here, and the terrain steeper, but neither of them cared. Somewhere just ahead, something had shifted in the forest, and they meant to find out what. Morning broke, with pale amber light filtering through the trees like the world had exhaled after a long, frozen night. A light fog lingered low across the forest floor, curling around the roots of ancient pines, and softening the edges of the rugged landscape. The storm had passed. Above, a streak of blue cut through the sky, faint but promising. The Bitterroot Range was waking up again, and with it, so was Shadow. The young German shepherd stirred beneath a large cedar, his ribs rising and falling in steady rhythm. His coat, once patchy with mud and snow, now bore the marks of survival, scars forming beneath fresh layers of fur. A notch on his ear, the steady strength in his posture. Shadow was no longer the frightened pup that had stumbled through the blizzard. He had faced the wilderness, the wolves, and the cold, but more importantly, he had faced himself, nearby. Ranger stood watch. His silhouette was etched against the horizon like a sentinel carved from stone. He didn't speak, but then again, he rarely did. His breath curled in the morning air, eyes scanning the distant tree line. Then, he turned to Shadow. "It's time," the old shepherd said simply. Shadow rose to his feet, muscles sore but steady. He didn't ask where they were going. For the first time, he knew. Ranger didn't lead this time. He followed. Shadow's nose worked the air, searching for something more familiar than prey or predator. A scent buried beneath days of snow, smoke, and forest. He picked up traces, cloth, pine sap, and blood. Faint, but human. He pressed forward. They moved fast, weaving through thickets and descending across snow-packed ridges. As they passed the glade where the wolves had scattered the night before, Shadow paused. The snow was disturbed. Tracks, canine and booted feet were nearby. His ears flicked, and he pushed ahead with purpose, down in the hollow below, under a gnarled white pine whose massive roots clawed into the riverbank like ancient fingers. Two figures emerged into view. Ben Carson stood hunched over a small campfire, a makeshift crutch wedged under one arm. His face was pale with exhaustion, wrapped in a coarse scarf, but his eyes were alive, scanning, hoping. Beside him was Emily Lang, her blonde hair pulled back into a tight braid beneath a ranger's wool cap. Her face, usually composed, was tired too, but lit with cautious optimism. A notebook stuck out of her jacket pocket, its pages already marked with smudges of pencil and pine soot. Shadow crested the ridge above them. Ben didn't see him at first, but Emily turned. She gasped, "Ben, look!" Ben followed her gaze. For a moment, he simply stared. Then, Shadow. His voice cracked, the pup's ears shot up, and with a sudden burst of speed, he bounded down the slope, his paws churning up snow, his breath steaming in clouds. Ben dropped the crutch and fell to his knees as Shadow crashed into his arms. The two clung together. Man and dog, mud, snow, and blood between them. But none of it mattered. "You found me," Ben whispered, burying his face into Shadow's fur. "You found your way home." Shadow let out a quiet whine, pressing his body against his handler like he was afraid Ben might disappear again. Emily stepped back, eyes shining, giving them space. Then her gaze lifted toward the top of the hill. Ranger stood watching. He didn't approach, he didn't speak. His expression was unreadable, but something flickered behind his tired eyes, something proud, something final. He turned to leave, but before he vanished into the trees, he took one last step toward the scene below. Shadow saw him, their eyes met, and then, without ceremony, Ranger lowered his head and gently pressed his nose against Shadow's forehead, a gesture without words, a farewell without sound, a blessing, then he was gone. Emily didn't speak for a long while. She just stood there, notebook clutched to her chest, heart thundering with the weight of what she'd witnessed. Later that day, after Ben and Shadow had been checked by a forest medic team called in by radio. After the fires had been doused and a helicopter arranged to take them down the mountain, Emily found herself back at her station. The office was warm, but still smelled of pine resin and wet dog. She sat at her desk and opened her notebook. Shadow. The pup who walked through wolves and found his way home, she wrote, not by fighting alone, but by learning who he truly was. The article was published a week later in the Montana Wildlife Journal, then picked up by a larger outlet. It spread. People shared it, not just because it was remarkable, but because it felt true. A story of loyalty, of fear and growth, of a bond not even the wild could break. Sometimes, the wilderness we face isn't just in the mountains, it's in our hearts, in the moments when we feel lost, abandoned, or afraid. Shadow began as a young, frightened pup, unsure of his path, surrounded by danger, left to survive alone, but through struggle, guidance, and faith. He found his strength not by overpowering the world, but by listening, learning, and trusting something greater. Ranger didn't just teach him how to survive, he showed him how to walk with purpose. And in that quiet blessing, in that final touch before vanishing into the trees, there was something more, a moment that felt like grace, like a miracle sent not by chance, but by God Himself. We all face storms, we all get lost, but sometimes God places someone or something on our path to remind us who we are and who we are meant to become, whether it's a dog, a stranger, or a moment of unexpected courage. These are signs that He is still watching, still guiding, still working in ways we cannot yet understand. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the strength that lives inside you, then share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment to tell us what part moved you most. And if you believe God still sends quiet miracles into this world, even in the form of a shepherd, then type Amen in the comments. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of hope, courage, and the unseen hands of grace that carry us through the darkest woods. May God bless you and all those still finding their way home.